It all started, as these things often do, with a piece of paper. Not a summons, not a foreclosure notice, just a crisp, slightly too important-looking envelope tucked into my mailbox, bearing the officious logo of the Harmony Ridge Homeowners Association. Now, I'd lived in Harmony Ridge for a good 7 years by then. Bought my little slice of suburbia because it was quiet, the lots were a decent size, and most importantly, it had these 3 magnificent oak trees at the very back of my property. They weren't just trees, they were characters, ancient sentinels that had probably seen the neighborhood sprout up around them. They gave me privacy from the houses uphill, dappled shade in the summer, and a sense of permanence that I'd come to cherish. The HOA. They were mostly a background hum, newsletters about petunias, reminders about trash can etiquette, the occasional squabble over fence heights that I'd hear about third hand. Nothing that ever directly bothered me. Until that letter. I remember standing in my kitchen, the afternoon sun slanting through the window, still in my work clothes, and slitting it open with a butter knife. The language was peculiar. Formal, yet vague. It spoke of community aesthetic standards and unobstructed enjoyment of neighborhood vistas. Then it got to the point, buried in a paragraph of HOA legalese, my trees, my beautiful, mature oak trees, were apparently causing a significant impediment to the designated scenic corridor. I read it again. Scenic corridor? What scenic corridor? From my backyard, all you could see uphill was more backyards. I laughed, honestly. This had to be a mistake, some overzealous intern misinterpreting a map, or maybe they'd sent it to the wrong address. These oaks were probably 100 years old, they were part of the landscape long before Harmony Ridge was even a twinkle in a developer's eye. The idea of them suddenly becoming an impediment was ludicrous. My first thought wasn't anger, not yet. It was more a bemused annoyance, like finding a parking ticket on your car when you know you fed the meter. A silly bureaucratic hiccup, easily smoothed over with a polite phone call. Or so I thought. Oh, if only I'd known then what I was stepping into. The naivety of it almost makes me smile now, in a grim sort of way. I pictured a quick chat, a mutual chuckle over the absurdity of it, and life would go on. But that letter wasn't a hiccup. It was the first shot fired in a war I didn't even know was being declared against my own backyard. A war over a view I couldn't even see, orchestrated by a man I'd barely noticed. The letter mentioned a specific bylaw, Article 4, Section 3, Subsection B. It sounded terribly official. I even dug out my dusty HOA covenants, a thick booklet I'd skimmed once when I bought the house and promptly forgotten. Sure enough, there it was, a typically convoluted sentence about maintaining views, but it was so broadly worded it could mean anything or nothing. Still, I wasn't overly concerned. Surely, common sense would prevail. These weren't some overgrown bushes I'd let run wild, these were stately oaks. The letter requested I submit a remediation plan within 30 days, which, it hinted darkly, should preferably involve the complete removal of the offending flora. Complete removal of trees that were probably saplings when my grandfather was a boy. The casual arrogance of it started to prickle beneath my initial amusement. I decided to call the HOA office the next morning. Maybe speak to someone reasonable, explain the situation. Little did I realize, reasonable was a foreign concept in the particular corner of the HOA I was about to encounter. That evening, I sat on my patio, looking up at the canopy of those oaks, their leaves rustling in the slight breeze. They weren't just blocking some imaginary, scenic corridor, they were my scenic corridor. They were home. And the thought of them being chainsawed down because of some bureaucratic whim started a slow burn of indignation deep in my gut. This wasn't just about trees, I began to sense. This was about something else entirely. The next morning, I called the HOA office. The woman who answered, a Mrs. Gable, had a voice that sounded like it had been permanently starched. I explained the letter, my confusion, the age and majesty of the trees. She listened with an air of profound disinterest, punctuated by little mms that conveyed zero actual understanding. Well, Mr. Davies, she said, her tone suggesting I was a particularly dense child, if you received a letter, it means there's an issue. The Scenic Corridor Committee has identified your property. Scenic Corridor Committee. That was a new one. It sounded like something out of a Monty Python sketch. I asked if I could speak to someone on this committee, or perhaps the HOA president. Mr. Henderson is the chair of the Scenic Corridor Committee, and he's also the HOA president, she chirped, a little too brightly. He's very particular about the views. A name. Mr. Henderson. I vaguely recalled him, a portly man with an air of self-importance I'd seen leading the annual HOA meetings, the ones I usually found an excuse to skip. He lived a few streets up, on the crest of the hill, one of those newer, larger houses with a panoramic deck. A little alarm bell went off in my head. Whose view, exactly, were we talking about? Mrs. Gable informed me that Mr. Henderson wasn't available for casual calls but that I could address my concerns at the next monthly HOA meeting. Or, I could simply submit my remediation plan. The implication was clear: compliance was the preferred, and easier, route. I decided the meeting was the way to go. I wanted to see this Henderson, look him in the eye, and appeal to reason. Surely, a face-to-face conversation would clear this up. The meeting was 2 weeks away. 2 weeks of stewing, rereading that blasted letter, and staring at my trees with a newfound sense of protectiveness. I even did a little research into Article 4, Section 3, Subsection B. It was, as I suspected, a masterpiece of ambiguity, written with enough loopholes to drive a bulldozer through. It mentioned preserving community sight lines but offered no specific definitions, no height restrictions, no list of protected views. It was a classic power grab clause, ripe for selective enforcement. During those 2 weeks, I also noticed something else. A white SUV, the kind Henderson drove, would frequently cruise slowly past my house, sometimes even pausing at the end of my street. Coincidence? Maybe. But the unease was growing. The day of the meeting arrived. I prepared a few talking points, even printed out some photos of my trees, thinking visual aids might help. The meeting was held in the small community clubhouse, a sterile room with uncomfortable plastic chairs and bad fluorescent lighting. About 20 people were there, mostly older residents, the usual HOA meeting crowd. Henderson sat at the head table, flanked by a couple of other board members who looked either bored or intimidated. He was exactly as I remembered, mid-50s, florid complexion, a suit that was a size too tight, and an expression that broadcasted his unwavering belief in his own correctness. When the agenda finally got to new business, I raised my hand. Henderson called on me with a curt nod, his eyes already narrowed. Yes, Mr. Davies. I stood up, introduced myself, and calmly explained the situation, the letter, the trees, their age, their importance to my property. I emphasized that I was a responsible homeowner, happy to maintain my property, but that removing these healthy, mature trees seemed extreme and unnecessary. Mr. Henderson, I said, trying to keep my tone respectful, I believe there must be some misunderstanding. These trees don't significantly obstruct any public view. Perhaps we could discuss a compromise, maybe some light trimming if absolutely necessary, though I'd prefer not to harm them. Henderson listened, a small, unpleasant smile playing on his lips. When I finished, he leaned into the microphone. Mr. Davies, he began, his voice dripping with condescension, the Harmony Ridge Homeowners Association, and specifically the Scenic Corridor Committee, which I chair, has determined that your trees are, in fact, an obstruction. A significant 1 inch. He gestured vaguely uphill. There's a lovely view of Blackwood Mountain from several properties along the ridge. A view that our residents paid a premium for. A view that your overgrown foliage is currently appropriating Blackwood Mountain. It was miles away, a faint silhouette on a clear day. The idea that my oaks were single-handedly appropriating this distant vista was absurd. With all due respect, Mr. Henderson, I countered, my trees might trim a tiny fraction of that view for a very limited number of houses. And they've been there for decades, long before many of those houses were built. Henderson puffed up. The bylaws are clear, Mr. Davies. Or perhaps you haven't read them. Article 4, Section 3, Subsection B. It's about maintaining the intended aesthetic of this community. Those trees are, frankly, an eyesore from certain perspectives and diminish property values. An eyesore. My magnificent oaks. I could feel my temper rising, but I fought to keep it down. I'm offering a compromise. Trimming will not suffice, Henderson snapped, his voice hardening. The committee has determined that full removal is the only acceptable remediation. You have until the deadline specified in your letter to comply. Failure to do so will result in daily fines, and eventually, the HOA will contract for the removal at your expense, plus legal fees. Is that clear? The room was silent. A few people looked uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. The other board members stared at their papers. It was clear Henderson ran this show. The threat was blatant. The arrogance, astounding. I realized then that reason wasn't going to work. This wasn't about a view. This was about power. His power. He wanted those trees gone, and he was going to use the full, petty weight of the HOA to make it happen. I left that meeting not just frustrated, but furious. The condescending tone, the unveiled threats, the sheer unreasonableness of it all. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a decree. The battle lines had been drawn, not by me, but by him. And as I walked home under the evening sky, the silhouettes of my oaks standing proud against the fading light, I made a silent promise to them, and to myself, Henderson wasn't going to win. Not without one hell of a fight. The days following that disastrous HOA meeting were a blur of simmering anger and strategic thinking. Henderson's smug, dismissive face was imprinted on my mind. His pronouncement of full removal echoed in my ears every time I looked at my trees. It was clear that polite requests and logical arguments were useless against a man so thoroughly convinced of his own petty dominion. My first move was to dive headfirst into the HOA covenants and restrictions, that dense, jargon-filled booklet I'd previously ignored. I read every page, every clause, every amendment, highlighting anything that seemed relevant, confusing, or potentially exploitable. Article 4, Section 3, Subsection B, the infamous view clause, remained the central point of contention. It was still as vague as ever, a beautifully crafted piece of deliberate ambiguity. But I also started noticing other things, rules about landscaping, property improvements, permissible planting lists, setback requirements. Nothing immediately jumped out as a silver bullet, but I was gathering ammunition. I also started a meticulous documentation process. I took dated photographs of my trees from every conceivable angle, including from the street where Henderson's white SUV had been seen lurking. I took photos of the view from the public road at the top of the hill, demonstrating just how minimal the alleged obstruction actually was. You had to crane your neck and squint on a very clear day to even argue my trees were in the direct line of sight of that distant mountain for more than a sliver. I saved every piece of correspondence from the HOA, no matter how trivial. A digital folder, and a physical one, began to swell with evidence. Then the predicted harassment began. It started subtly. A notice about my grass being 1/4 of an inch too high according to some obscure seasonal guideline. I mowed it that evening, took a photo with a ruler, and emailed it to Mrs. Gable with a polite, problem rectified, note. A week later, a warning about my trash cans being visible from the street for 2 hours longer than permitted on collection day. I started setting a timer. Then came a notice about a small crack in my driveway, something that had been there since I bought the house, suddenly deemed a safety hazard requiring immediate repair. Each notice was a pinprick, designed to annoy, to wear me down, to show me who was in charge. Henderson, I imagined, was orchestrating this campaign of petty tyranny from his perch on the hill, probably chuckling into his coffee. I complied with everything, meticulously. I fixed the driveway crack. I became a paragon of trash can etiquette. My lawn was a model of HOA-approved height. With each compliance, I sent a polite, documented email. I was building a record of being a model resident, despite their provocations. This wasn't just about defiance anymore, it was about strategy. If this ever went further, I wanted to show a clear pattern of targeted harassment following my refusal to kowtow on the tree issue. During this time, I had a chance encounter with a neighbor, Mrs. Albright, an elderly lady who'd lived in Harmony Ridge since it was mostly fields. She'd seen Henderson's SUV parked near my house too. "That man, Henderson," she said, shaking her head, her voice a conspiratorial whisper as we both collected our mail. "He's got a bee in his bonnet about those trees of yours, dear. He's always been one for rules, but mostly rules that benefit him." She told me a story about how Henderson had forced another neighbor to repaint their front door because he didn't like the shade of blue, even though it wasn't explicitly forbidden. "He likes to feel important," she concluded. "Don't let him bully you." Her quiet support was a small comfort, a reminder that not everyone in the neighborhood was a Henderson acolyte. I also sent a formal, registered letter to the HOA board, reiterating my position on the trees, outlining their age and health, and formally stating my refusal to remove them. I pointed out the vagueness of the bylaw they were citing and the lack of any specific, measurable criteria for view obstruction. I suggested again that a neutral, certified arborist be consulted to assess the trees and the alleged obstruction. I received no direct reply to the substance of my letter, only another automated reminder that my remediation plan was overdue and fines would soon commence. The fines started a week later, $50 a day. The letters were piling up. The pressure was mounting. I knew I couldn't just keep reacting to their moves. I needed to go on the offensive, but legally, carefully. This wasn't just about saving my trees anymore. It was about principle. It was about standing up to a bully who wielded a petty rulebook like a scepter. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a tiny, rebellious seed of an idea was starting to sprout, an idea that was as audacious as Henderson's demands. If he was obsessed with what he could see, or rather, what he couldn't see, from his precious hilltop, maybe, just maybe, I could give him something truly remarkable to look at. Or, more accurately, something he couldn't look past. The idea, when it finally crystallized, felt like a thunderclap in the quiet desperation of my strategic planning. It wasn't born of a single eureka moment, but rather a slow burn of indignation coalescing with a stubborn refusal to be defeated. I'd been poring over the HOA's labyrinthine rules and regulations for weeks, cross-referencing them with local county ordinances on landscaping and property boundaries. My nights were filled with the dry rustle of paper and the glow of my computer screen as I navigated obscure legal forums and horticultural websites. The HOA rules were surprisingly detailed about what you couldn't do: no fences over a certain height, no unapproved shed designs, no non-native invasive species. But they were also quite specific, almost encouraging, about what you could do in terms of beautification and enhancing natural screening, provided you used approved plant species and adhered to setback requirements from property lines. And that's where the loophole, or rather, the opportunity, lay. They were so focused on stopping me from having my existing mature oaks, they hadn't really considered what I might add. The bylaw Henderson kept citing, Article 4, Section 3, Subsection B, was about maintaining views, implying a static state. It didn't explicitly forbid new plantings that might, over time, create a screen. It was all about interpretation, and Henderson had interpreted it to mean my old trees had to go. What if I interpreted the landscaping guidelines to mean I could improve my privacy dramatically? My property backed onto an undeveloped strip of common land before rising to the houses on the hill, including Henderson's. There was a decent buffer. The HOA rules had a list of approved trees and shrubs, mostly native, non-invasive species. Some of them, I discovered with a thrill of dawning inspiration, were known for being relatively fast-growing and capable of forming dense screens. The thought was audacious: if Henderson was going to wage war over a sliver of a distant mountain view allegedly blocked by 3 oaks, what if I gave him a whole new landscape to contend with? Not just replacing the oaks if I lost them, but creating a lush, dense, and perfectly legal green barrier along my entire back property line. A forest. My own private, HOA-compliant, Henderson-infuriating forest. It was deliciously defiant. The beauty of it was that I wouldn't be breaking any explicit rules. I'd be landscaping. I'd be enhancing my property. I'd be using approved species. The very bureaucracy they were wielding against me could be my shield. I started researching with a new fervor. Leland cypress. Too common, and some HOAs were starting to restrict them due to their massive size. Arborvitae. Green giants, perhaps. They were fast-growing, dense, and generally well-regarded. Various native pines and firs. I made lists, checked growth rates, mature heights, and, crucially, their suitability for my soil and climate. I even discreetly consulted a local nursery owner, a grizzled old chap named Silas who had a mischievous twinkle in his eye. I didn't lay out my entire plan, just said I was looking to create a substantial privacy screen along my back fence line and wanted fast-growing, hardy, native options. Silas, without batting an eyelid, recommended a few varieties, including a particularly vigorous type of native cedar and some robust, quick-spreading clumping bamboo, the non-invasive kind, of course, strictly according to the HOA's approved list which I conveniently brought along. He even gave me tips on planting them for optimal density. "Going for some serious privacy, are ya?" he asked, a knowing grin spreading across his face. "Something like that," I replied, feeling a surge of almost giddy anticipation. The plan wasn't just about defiance anymore. It was about turning their own tactics against them. Henderson wanted a clear view. I'd give him a clear view of the back of my impenetrable green wall. The pettiness of the HOA's attacks, the grass, the trash cans, the driveway crack, suddenly seemed less like harassment and more like fuel. Every fine notice, every condescending letter, solidified my resolve. I started sketching out a planting plan in a notebook, calculating spacing, envisioning the mature canopy. It was an ambitious undertaking, a significant investment of time and money. But the thought of Henderson's face when he realized what I was doing, the sheer, unadulterated karmic justice of it, was priceless. This wasn't just about saving 3 trees anymore. It was about cultivating a monument to bureaucratic overreach, a living testament to the fact that if you push someone too far, they might just decide to re-landscape your entire perspective. The fines for the original oaks were still accumulating, of course. I was setting that money aside, preparing for a potential legal battle over them specifically. But the forest project was separate, a proactive measure, my own strategic offensive in this bizarre neighborhood war. The beauty of it was its legality. I'd be following their rules to the letter, even as I subverted their unspoken agenda. The irony was exquisite. Let Henderson worry about his distant mountain. I was about to give him a much closer, much greener, and much more personal point of interest. The day the first truckload of saplings arrived felt like D-Day, but with more mulch. I'd meticulously planned it, ordering from several nurseries to get the variety and quantity I needed. My driveway was suddenly a staging area for dozens of young trees and shrubs, slender whips of cedar, bushy arborvitae, pots of the approved clumping bamboo, and a selection of other fast-growing native species Silas had recommended. My neighbors, the ones who weren't Henderson's cronies, looked on with a mixture of curiosity and quiet amusement. Mrs. Albright gave me a thumbs up from her porch. I'd taken a week off work, cashing in some vacation days for what I dubbed Project Verdant Vengeance in my private thoughts. The physical labor was intense. The soil at the back of my property was rocky in places, and digging dozens of holes was back-breaking. But every drop of sweat felt like a small act of rebellion. I wasn't just planting trees, I was planting defiance. I followed my sketched plan precisely, spacing the trees for optimal future density, ensuring they were well within the setback requirements from the property line as stipulated in the HOA covenants. I even double-checked the maximum mature height of each species against any, non-existent, as it turned out, specific height restrictions for new plantings in the bylaws. I was creating a multi-layered screen, taller evergreens at the very back, stepping down to slightly shorter, bushier varieties, with the bamboo strategically placed for rapid fill-in. It was going to be magnificent. And, more importantly, impenetrable. It didn't take long for Henderson to notice. On the second day of planting, his white SUV made its customary slow pass. This time, it stopped. Henderson himself got out, a rare occurrence. He stood at the edge of his own manicured lawn, several houses up the hill, and just stared down at my property. I couldn't see his expression clearly from that distance, but his posture radiated disapproval. I just waved cheerfully, a spade in my hand, covered in dirt and sweat, and went back to digging. Let him watch. Let him wonder. Later that afternoon, an official-looking HOA vehicle pulled up, not Henderson, but one of his board member lieutenants, a nervous little man named Peterson. He approached me warily. "Mr. Davies," he began, clutching a clipboard like a shield. "We've, received some concerns about the extensive landscaping project you've undertaken." "Concerns?" I replied, wiping sweat from my brow with the back of a muddy glove. "I'm just beautifying my property, Mr. Peterson. Adding some lovely native plants, all from the HOA-approved list. Isn't that encouraged?" I even had a laminated copy of the relevant bylaw section and the approved plant list ready in my pocket, which I casually produced. Peterson blinked at it, clearly out of his depth. "Well, yes, but the sheer volume of it. And its proximity to the, scenic corridor. I feigned puzzlement. "I'm well within my property lines, and these are all approved species for screening and natural landscaping. Surely you're not suggesting I can't improve my own yard?" Peterson stammered something about intent and community spirit, but he had no concrete violation to point to. My new saplings were tiny, they weren't blocking anyone's view of anything yet. He mumbled about needing to consult with Mr. Henderson and scurried off. The next day, a new letter arrived. This one was different. It didn't cite a violation. Instead, it was a friendly reminder about maintaining open and harmonious vistas, and cautioned against any plantings that might, eventually, obstruct views. It was toothless, a clear sign of their unease. They knew I was technically compliant, and it was driving them nuts. I continued my work. My muscles ached, my hands were raw, but a grim satisfaction fueled me. Friends who'd heard about my HOA saga even came by to help on the weekend, turning the planting into a sort of defiant festival. We grilled burgers, drank lemonade, and put nearly 100 young trees and shrubs into the ground. By the end of the week, the back of my property was transformed. It didn't look like a forest yet, just a hopeful collection of sticks and small bushes. But I knew what it would become. Henderson knew what it would become. His SUV made more frequent passes, sometimes parking up the hill for extended periods, a silent, fuming sentinel. The daily fines for my original oak trees continued to arrive, of course. That was a separate battlefront. But now, I had opened a new one where I was dictating the terms. The initial reactions from the HOA were exactly what I'd hoped for: confusion, then barely concealed anger, and a dawning realization that I wasn't just going to roll over. They thought they could bully me into submission over 3 trees. They had no idea I was prepared to cultivate an entire ecosystem of defiance. The best part? I was doing it all by their own damn rules. The months that followed the Great Planting Initiative were a strange blend of quiet anticipation and escalating, petty warfare. My fledgling forest began to take root, quite literally. I watered diligently, mulched, and whispered words of encouragement to the young cedars and arborvitae. They were small, unassuming, but I could already see the promise of future density in their tentative branches. Meanwhile, the HOA, under Henderson's increasingly agitated direction, ramped up its campaign of peripheral harassment. It was as if, unable to directly attack my new landscaping project, yet, they were determined to make my life miserable in every other conceivable way. I received a notice that the paint on my mailbox post was faded and inconsistent with community standards. I repainted it a vibrant, HOA-approved shade of black, sending photographic evidence of my compliance. Then came a complaint about a visible water hose left coiled beside my garage, deemed an unsightly utility implement. I bought a decorative hose reel. My recycling bin was apparently placed 3 inches too far from the curb on collection day, resulting in a sternly worded warning. I started measuring. Each new infraction, each petty demand, was met with prompt, documented compliance. I became a model of HOA obedience in all matters except the original oaks and, by silent implication, my burgeoning green screen. I imagined Henderson and his committee huddled together, poring over the bylaws, desperately seeking some clause, any clause, I might have violated with my new plantings. But I had been meticulous. The species were approved. The setbacks were correct. There were no height restrictions on new plantings, only vague exhortations about future obstruction, which were legally nebulous. The daily fines for the oaks continued to accumulate. I kept paying them into a separate account, a war chest for the inevitable legal showdown over those trees. The new forest was my strategic masterpiece, but the old oaks were still a matter of principle. Henderson himself became a more visible, if distant, antagonist. I'd see him on his deck, sometimes with binoculars, glaring down at my property. The slow, inexorable growth of my green barrier must have been like a personal affront to him, a daily reminder of his inability to control me. He tried to rally support among other uphill neighbors, I heard through the grapevine. He painted me as a rogue homeowner, a troublemaker intent on destroying community harmony and property values. But his narrative wasn't gaining much traction. Some neighbors were intimidated by him, yes, but others were secretly amused by my botanical rebellion. A few even quietly expressed their support, tired of Henderson's overbearing reign. One neighbor, whose property also bordered the common land, even asked me for advice on privacy plantings, a subtle nod of solidarity. The psychological toll was undeniable. Living under constant scrutiny, waiting for the next petty notice, was stressful. There were days I felt exhausted by the sheer effort of it all. But then I'd look at my young trees, see a new inch of growth on a cedar, a fresh frond unfurling on a bamboo stalk, and my resolve would harden. They were growing, and with them, my quiet confidence. The HOA did try to get clever. They proposed an emergency amendment to the landscaping bylaws at one meeting, aiming to introduce retroactive height limits on all property line plantings and a specific ban on dense vegetative screens exceeding 6 feet. I attended that meeting, of course. I, along with a surprising number of other residents who were tired of Henderson's unilateral power grabs, spoke out against it. We pointed out the retroactive nature was unfair, that it penalized responsible homeowners who had followed existing rules, and that such drastic changes required more community consultation. The amendment was narrowly defeated, much to Henderson's visible fury. He had underestimated the simmering resentment within his own kingdom. My little forest was becoming a symbol, not just for me, but for others who felt the HOA had overstepped. The waiting game continued. Spring turned to summer, then to autumn. The trees grew. Not dramatically, not yet, but steadily. Each passing season added a few more inches, a bit more fullness. Henderson's view of that distant mountain, the one he'd started this whole war over, was slowly, incrementally, beginning to shrink, not just from the old oaks, but from the combined efforts of dozens of new, legally planted upstarts. His obsession was, quite literally, being walled off by his own making. The irony was not lost on me, and it provided a dark, satisfying humor to the otherwise draining situation. I was in it for the long haul. My forest wasn't just a collection of plants, it was a patient, growing strategy, a green siege against a petty tyrant. And with every passing day, its defenses, and my position, grew stronger. Another year rolled by, then a second. Time, as they say, marches on, and in my backyard, it marched with a green and leafy vengeance. My fledgling forest was no longer quite so fledgling. The Leland cypresses eyed, judiciously, and in an HOA-approved variant, mind you, planted were showing their renowned vigor, shooting upwards with surprising speed. The arborvitae were filling out, their feathery foliage creating increasingly dense walls of green. The clumping bamboo, my secret weapon for rapid coverage in certain spots, had formed lush, impenetrable thickets. From my patio, the view of the uphill houses was becoming pleasantly fractured, softened by layers of green. From Henderson's deck, I could only imagine, the effect was far more pronounced. That sliver of Blackwood Mountain he so cherished, the one my 3 ancient oaks had supposedly appropriated, was now well and truly gone. Not just obscured, but obliterated. Vanished behind a verdant, multi-textured, and entirely HOA-compliant tapestry of my making. The change was undeniable, and Henderson, to put it mildly, was losing his meticulously landscaped mind. His frustration, which had once simmered, now boiled over regularly. The HOA meetings, which I now attended with a certain grim satisfaction, became Henderson-centric rants. He'd rail against irresponsible landscaping, blatant disregard for community aesthetics, and individuals who deliberately undermine the neighborhood's character. He never named me directly in these tirades, but everyone knew who he was talking about. His face would get red, his voice would climb in pitch, and his gaze would invariably flick towards me, sitting calmly in the audience, perhaps taking notes. The petty violation notices continued, of course, but they had an air of desperation now. A demand that I power wash a barely visible spot of mildew on my north-facing siding. A complaint that my outdoor thermometer was not of an approved design. There was, of course, no approved design list for thermometers. I complied, always complied, with cheerful, documented alacrity. My file of HOA interactions was now several inches thick, a testament to their obsessive harassment and my equally obsessive compliance. The real entertainment, however, was witnessing Henderson's escalating panic. He tried to get the HOA board to issue a direct order for me to remove the new plantings. But even his most loyal cronies were hesitant. I hadn't broken any written rules. The trees were approved species. They were on my property. They had been planted before any new, more restrictive, and defeated, amendments had been proposed. Their own lawyer, a cautious man who probably smelled a losing battle, reportedly advised them that they had very little legal ground to stand on regarding the new forest. So, they doubled down on the original oaks. The fines for those 3 trees had now reached a ludicrous sum. The official letters regarding them became more threatening, hinting at imminent legal action to forcibly enter my property, remove the oaks, and place a lien on my house for the costs. This was the fight they thought they could win. This was where they would make their stand. I consulted a lawyer, a sharp woman named Ms. Albright, no relation to my supportive neighbor, though the coincidence was amusing. I laid out the whole saga, the initial letter, Henderson's vendetta, the harassment, my meticulous documentation, and, of course, Project Verdant Vengeance. She listened patiently, reviewed my files, and a slow smile spread across her face. Mr. Davies, she said, Mr. Henderson appears to have dug himself quite a hole, and you've just helped him landscape it. She confirmed that their case regarding the new plantings was incredibly weak, bordering on frivolous. As for the original oaks, while the bylaw was vague, their pattern of targeted harassment and Henderson's clear personal vendetta would be strong factors in my defense. She advised me to continue documenting everything and to prepare for them to eventually make a legal move. They're painted into a corner, she explained. Henderson's ego won't let him back down, especially now that your privacy screen is a daily monument to his impotence. He'll push for a fight, likely over the original trees, because it's the only hook he thinks he has left, and so, we waited. The forest grew, a silent, green testament to a battle of wills. Henderson fumed. The HOA sent increasingly desperate-sounding letters. I, meanwhile, started to genuinely enjoy the lush, private sanctuary my backyard was becoming. The birds loved it. The squirrels were ecstatic. It was ironic, in his quest to secure a tiny, distant view for himself, Henderson had gifted me a magnificent, close-up one of my own thriving ecosystem. The ticking time bomb was my new forest's ever-increasing height and density, and Henderson's ever-decreasing patience. Sooner or later, something had to give. And I had a feeling it wouldn't be my trees. The shoe, as they say, finally dropped, not with a quiet thud, but with the loud, officious slap of a legal summons delivered by a bewildered-looking courier. The Harmony Ridge Homeowners Association, at the unwavering insistence of its esteemed president, Mr. Reginald Henderson, was formally suing me. Not for the new forest, their lawyers had evidently, and wisely, counseled against that particular folly. No, they were coming after the original 3 oak trees, demanding their immediate removal and payment of the accumulated, and now astronomical, fines, plus all legal costs. It was the showdown Henderson had been itching for, his last, best hope of asserting his dominance and salvaging his bruised ego. He probably imagined a swift victory, me humbled and forced to capitulate, his precious mountain view, or what was left of it after my other landscaping efforts, partially restored. He clearly hadn't reckoned on the sheer depth of my preparation, or the quiet fury that had been simmering within me for years. My lawyer, Ms. Albright, was unfazed. Predictable, she said, reviewing the summons. He's playing the only card he thinks he has. And it's a weak 1-inch. We filed our response immediately, denying their claims and, crucially, filing a counterclaim. We weren't just defending, we were accusing the HOA, and Henderson specifically, of a sustained campaign of harassment, abuse of power, selective enforcement of vague bylaws, and actions constituting a private nuisance. We detailed every petty violation notice, every threatening letter, every documented instance of Henderson's fixation on my property. My meticulous records, once a source of weary effort, now became our most potent weapon. The lawsuit didn't go to a full jury trial, much to my initial, fleeting disappointment. I'd rather fancied the idea of Henderson squirming on a witness stand. Instead, as is common in HOA disputes, it was mandated to go through binding arbitration. The arbitrator was a retired judge, a stern-looking woman named Judge Blackwell, who, according to Ms. Albright, had a reputation for no-nonsense fairness and a low tolerance for frivolous litigation. The arbitration hearing was held in a sterile conference room at a legal office. Henderson was there, naturally, looking self-important in an ill-fitting suit, flanked by the HOA's lawyer and a couple of nervous board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. I sat with Ms. Albright, a thick binder of my evidence on the table in front of us. The HOA's lawyer presented their case first. It was all about Article 4, Section 3, Subsection B, the sanctity of the scenic corridor, and my supposed blatant disregard for community welfare. They presented grainy photographs, taken from an awkward angle uphill, trying to argue that my oaks were indeed a heinous obstruction. They glossed over the age of the trees and the vagueness of the bylaw. Henderson even gave a pompous little speech about his duties as president and his commitment to upholding property values, his voice oozing insincere concern. Then it was our turn. Ms. Albright was a force of nature. Calmly, methodically, she dismantled their arguments. She highlighted the ambiguity of the bylaw, the lack of any specific definition or measurement for obstruction. She presented my photographs, clearly showing the minimal impact of the oaks on any conceivable public view. Then she moved to the counterclaim. She detailed the relentless barrage of violation notices for trivial matters, starting almost immediately after I first questioned the tree removal demand. She showed the timeline, the pattern. She even brought up Henderson's frequent, documented surveillance of my property. This was never about a scenic corridor, Your Honor, Ms. Albright stated, her voice firm. This was about Mr. Davies refusing to bow to Mr. Henderson's arbitrary demand. It became a personal vendetta, pursued with the HOA's resources and authority, designed to harass and intimidate a homeowner into submission. When I testified, I simply recounted the facts, my love for the trees, my attempts at compromise, the escalating harassment, and the stress it had caused. I spoke about the forest I had planted, not as a point of contention in this specific case, but as context for my desire for privacy and peaceful enjoyment of my property, which had been so thoroughly disrupted. I mentioned that all those new plantings were, of course, fully compliant with HOA rules. I saw Henderson flinch at that. Throughout our presentation, Judge Blackwell listened intently, her expression unreadable. She asked pointed questions of both sides. When she questioned Henderson about the sudden flurry of violation notices against me, his answers were evasive and unconvincing. He blustered about upholding standards for all residents, but it sounded hollow even to my ears. The weakness of the HOA's case was laid bare. They were trying to enforce a subjective, ill-defined rule against one resident, primarily driven by the personal animosity of their president, who himself was now facing accusations of misconduct. The arbitration lasted a full day. By the end, Henderson looked deflated, his usual arrogance replaced by a sheen of sweat and a worried frown. The HOA's lawyer looked like he was regretting taking the case. We left the conference room feeling cautiously optimistic. Judge Blackwell said she would issue her written decision within 2 weeks. The waiting began again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't the anxious dread of before, but a tense anticipation. The fate of my oaks, and Henderson's reign, hung in the balance. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, exactly 13 days after the arbitration hearing. The subject line was stark, Decision in HOA v. Davies arbitration. My heart hammered against my ribs as I clicked it open. Ms. Albright had forwarded it with a simple, jubilant message, "We won. Call me." I scanned the attached PDF, my eyes racing through the legal jargon until I found the operative phrases. The arbitrator finds in favor of the respondent, Daniel Davies, on all claims asserted by the Harmony Ridge Homeowners Association. The HOA's demand for removal of the oak trees is denied. The accumulated fines are hereby nullified. A wave of relief so profound washed over me that I actually felt my knees weaken. I had to sit down. I read it again, slowly this time, savoring every word. Not only had Judge Blackwell sided with me on the trees, but she had also addressed our counterclaim. She found that the HOA, under Henderson's leadership, had indeed engaged in a pattern of conduct constituting harassment and selective enforcement. She didn't award monetary damages for that, as those are hard to quantify in such cases, but she issued a stern warning to the HOA about its future conduct and ordered them to pay a significant portion of my legal fees. My legal fees. That was the cherry on top. The judgment was a complete vindication. My oaks were safe. Henderson's vendetta had failed spectacularly. I called Ms. Albright, and we had a brief, celebratory conversation. She saw right through him, Daniel, Ms. Albright said. His arrogance was his undoing. And your meticulous records were our triumph. The news of the ruling spread through Harmony Ridge like wildfire. My phone started ringing with calls from neighbors. Mrs. Albright, the elder, supportive one, was ecstatic. Others offered congratulations. Some even confessed their own past run-ins with Henderson and expressed relief that his power had been checked. The atmosphere in the neighborhood palpably shifted. The fallout for Henderson was swift and brutal. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting, one I wasn't invited to, but the details trickled out quickly. Faced with the arbitrator's damning findings, the prospect of paying my legal fees out of HOA funds, and a rising tide of resident discontent, Henderson's support on the board evaporated. He was reportedly asked to resign as president and from the Scenic Corridor Committee, which, it turned out, pretty much just consisted of him. He initially refused, blustering about appealing the decision, but the HOA's lawyer apparently advised him that an appeal would be costly and almost certainly futile. Within a week, a sheepish newsletter from the HOA announced Henderson's resignation from all official positions, citing personal reasons. Just like that, his reign of petty tyranny was over. I saw him a few times after that, mostly from a distance. He still lived up on the hill, but the arrogant swagger was gone. He looked diminished, a man whose carefully constructed kingdom of rules and regulations had crumbled around him. He never made eye contact. My forest, of course, continued to thrive. It was now a lush, dense, and wonderfully private barrier. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Henderson's obsessive quest for an unobstructed view had resulted in him having no view at all, at least not in my direction. He was now permanently screened off by a living monument to his own folly, what some of my more waggish neighbors had started calling the Henderson Memorial Forest. The sense of triumph was immense, but it was also mixed with a quiet satisfaction and a profound sense of relief. The constant stress, the petty battles, the feeling of being under siege, it was all finally over. I could walk out into my backyard, listen to the rustling leaves of my ancient oaks and my new, vibrant forest, and just breathe. I had stood my ground, fought the good fight, and against a seemingly entrenched power, I had won. It wasn't just a victory for me and my trees, it felt like a victory for common sense and decency. Life after the great HOA war settled into a new, more peaceful rhythm. The Henderson Memorial Forest, as it was affectionately, or perhaps not so affectionately, depending on who you asked, known, was flourishing. What started as a line of hopeful saplings was now a truly impressive wall of green. The cedars and arborvitae had knitted together, their foliage dense and deep, creating an almost unbroken screen. The bamboo rustled soothingly in the breeze, a sound I'd come to associate with victory. My backyard was no longer just a yard, it was a sanctuary, a private haven shielded from the uphill world, all thanks to Mr. Henderson's initial unreasonable demand. The privacy was incredible. I could sit on my patio with my morning coffee in blissful seclusion, the only sounds the chirping of birds nesting in their new high-rise accommodations and the gentle sigh of the wind through the leaves. The view, my view, was of lush greenery, a vibrant tapestry of different shades and textures. It was, I often thought with a smile, far superior to any distant, hazy mountain. The Harmony Ridge HOA underwent a significant transformation. With Henderson gone, a new board was elected, composed of residents who seemed more interested in genuine community well-being than in petty power plays. The infamous Article 4, Section 3, Subsection B was reviewed and amended to include clear, objective criteria for any future view obstruction claims, requiring demonstrable impact on multiple properties and a consensus-based approach to resolution. They even added a clause encouraging privacy landscaping using approved native species, a subtle nod, perhaps, to my successful campaign. The tone of HOA communications softened. The newsletters focused on community events and positive initiatives rather than scoldings and threats. The rain of nitpicky violation notices ceased, not just for me, but for everyone. It was as if a dark cloud had lifted from the neighborhood. I found myself becoming more involved, attending meetings not out of obligation or defiance, but because I realized that a healthy HOA required engaged residents to prevent the rise of another Henderson. My experience, it turned out, had inadvertently inspired others to take a more active role. We weren't just homeowners anymore, we were custodians of our community's character, ensuring it remained a place of harmony, not harassment. Occasionally, I'd see Henderson puttering in his yard or driving through the neighborhood. He always looked straight ahead, avoiding eye contact. I bore him no ill will anymore, his own actions had been his undoing. He was a living testament to the old adage, be careful what you wish for, and be even more careful who you pick a fight with over it. He'd wanted a clear view, and in the end, he got exactly what he deserved, a clear view of the consequences of his arrogance, reflected in the impenetrable green wall that had risen to meet his challenge. Reflecting on the whole absurd, stressful, yet ultimately empowering saga, a few lessons always come to mind. First, know your rights and the rules that govern you, whether it's an HOA covenant or a local ordinance. Knowledge truly is power. Second, document everything. Every letter, every email, every interaction, every photograph. In a battle of, he said, she said, the one with the meticulously organized binder often prevails. Third, don't underestimate the power of quiet, persistent, and legally sound defiance. Bullies often rely on their victims being too intimidated or too weary to fight back. Sometimes, standing your ground, even when it's exhausting, is the only way. And finally, there's a certain delicious satisfaction in what some might call malicious compliance, or as I prefer to think of it, strategic adherence to the letter of the law. When faced with unreasonable demands, sometimes the best response is to use the existing rules in unexpected, creative, and entirely defensible ways. My forest is a testament to that. It's more than just trees, it's a symbol of resilience, a green badge of honor. It reminds me that even an ordinary person, pushed too far, can cultivate extraordinary results. And every time I hear the wind rustling through its leaves, I can't help but smile. Mr. Henderson wanted a view. I gave him a legacy. A dense, thriving, perfectly legal legacy that will likely outlast us both. And that, my friends, is what you call poetic justice, served with a side of well-rotted compost.